Nisid Hajari is going to join us. He's a senior columnist at Bloomberg Opinion and an old friend. James Crabtree, researcher, analyst, author, and journalist extraordinaire. And John Micklethwait, the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News. So much technology and so little time. So, John, I asked you earlier, are you an off-ramp guy? When we talk about Putin, obviously missiles fell in Poland overnight. This raises what's now been a month-long question about how to deal with Vladimir Putin. What are the consequences militarily of taking both a harder stance or a softer stance? And I'd be curious to know what you think right now, given what happened overnight. Where will NATO reside on this? And how should the U.S. think about Putin now?
I think several things. Firstly is on the question of the actual missiles, it's worth saying kind of very clearly that it's not absolutely cut and dried. These are Russian missiles fired by Russia because both sides use Russian missiles. It is possible that this was Ukrainian missiles trying to shoot down Russian missiles coming in. Whichever way, the kind of starting problem was Russian missiles coming through. Technically, Poland has the right to say that it's under attack and say this is an Article 4 moment. The difficulty with that, and that's where things get quite difficult, because you look at the way that Putin has thought about NATO, the way he's tried to test it. One of his deliberate ploys in the past was always to look at the idea of maybe countries like Estonia, those ones on the edge where you could begin to cause problems, and then you could try and get people to invoke the article. And once they've invoked the article, then maybe NATO would not rush because it would be seen as something inside. This particular case, if Poland was to go running and say, we want this to be a collective defense thing, people will say, well, look, it was just on the border, it was a mistake, etc. So anything that destabilizes NATO is generally something that Putin wants. It's been one of the great aims of his policy, and to begin with, in terms of reaching out towards or invading Ukraine, that was seen as one of the side effects. So this is one of those moments where you imagine everything is very clear. It's a Russian missile, everyone's getting joined on one side. I'm not quite so sure. You could imagine some of the less vigorous members of NATO saying, look, this was obviously not an attack on Poland, etc., etc. So you have to be rather careful about what you imagine for. I think in the end, though, this is obviously bad for Putin. People like Nisid and James can talk about the effect in Asia. You've already had yesterday Xi Jinping and Biden coming together and talking about nuclear missiles and the desire to avoid that. Well, this is another sign that they also perhaps will think that Putin is out of control. The really interesting group in this is, I think, not the people in the West, it's the people in Moscow and the people around Putin. We know so little about that, and we probably won't know much until anything actually happens. But you have to imagine that the coalition of people in Russia who are hurting because of policies that Putin has taken on, and perhaps more importantly, policies that Putin has continued for reasons of personal survival, is growing. And this is another piece of evidence that some group of people close to Putin, or in that particular circle, might think it is time for a change. So that is, I think, the deeper risk to Putin.
Sort of stepping away from the minutiae of this incident and to think more broadly, philosophically, about how and militarily and economically, how the West should position itself towards Putin. I think there's an argument to be made that Putin was accommodated after the 2013 invasion of Crimea, with the idea that that might settle him down. And now we've discovered that he didn't settle down, that in fact he's become more aggressive. So what would that recommend for how to respond right now to a war he's waging in Ukraine, and the best way to manage either an end to that war or a containment of Putin's ambitions?
I think the first point is very straightforward, is stay united. The more that NATO comes apart, the more that helps Putin in a way. I think in terms of his ambitions have all, if you even talk to him for a short while, it comes across. He wants a greater Russia. He thinks that Russia was humiliated, and he sees that's the starting point. But his actual tactics of going through it are pretty opportunistic. I think when he sees weakness, he goes for it. And I think particularly when it came up to Crimea, and for a long time, America in particular, made the mistake of being dismissive about Putin, rude basically in public, which was not something that was going to ever make Putin
and in his
happy,
view, provocative,
but not standing up to him, and that was the problem. Putin senses weakness. If you talk to Putin privately,
which you have,
yeah, all he will ever ask you about is he will ask you about world leaders, he's an old-style KGB agent. He wants to know what people's weaknesses are and what their strengths are. And this precise moment, he will be recalibrating and trying to think what the weaknesses of the NATO are. You know, he's a realist, Putin. I think people often look and see what he's done in the Ukraine and say this is the act of someone who's unhinged. What he did in Ukraine is deeply evil. But if you follow the consequence of having made a botched invasion, you could argue that someone whose regime and possibly whose life and also the lives of his family and everything else depends on him being able to have some kind of quote-unquote successful or being able to claim something out of Ukraine, everything he's done recently fits fairly logically into that stream. Putin needs an out.
But he's just been embarrassed again, too, by this. He's just been embarrassed again.
Yes.
He's got a military that he doesn't appear to have great control over. He's got a military that was, proclaimed as a 21st century machine, but it looks like a 15th century apparatus run by 16th century thinkers.
This has happened before. If you remember the missile that struck down the Malaysian airline, that was a Russian missile that was established. So once I even on a stage like this, I put it to Putin that there are two explanations. Either number one, he deliberately shot down the Malaysian airliner, or number two, his armed forces are so incompetent they can't keep hold of their missiles. That is the problem about Russia is big and disorganized and frightened of a man at the top. So in terms of one of the initial things Putin will be trying to do is trying to work out whether this did happen, that didn't. We've all seen how chaotic parts of the Russian military are and how incompetent they are. So he's got that to deal with as well. So I think from his point of view, his first thought will be always hanging on to domestic power. Not perhaps that unlike our Chinese counterpart, but the same basic starting point.
Which is a nice segue, James, into talking about the fact that President Xi is undoubtedly watching the U.S. response to Ukraine and the Western European response to the Ukraine invasion, and wondering how that adds up in his own view of whether or not to reabsorb Taiwan into the PRC. What do you think Xi is going to conclude from today's episode? What kind of a response would he want to see? And do you feel optimistic, given at least some of the more diplomatic language that's come out of the meeting in Bali this week? Both Xi and Biden jointly said they found the possibility of Putin using nukes as reprehensible. That seemed like a bright spot in what has otherwise been a troubled relationship.
I think John's right. This is a bad week for Putin. What Xi would want is the most disorganized and disunited NATO response possible. I don't think that's what they're going to get. I mean, my sense is that what will come out of this in the European side will be that those voices who've been calling for more help for Ukraine, so the Baltic nations, Poland in particular, the Eastern Europeans, the United Kingdom, want to give new missile systems to Ukraine, want to give more weapons of different sorts. They're going to have the wind at their back now, as you have a meeting tomorrow in the G7 meeting in Bali. For China-US, the meeting this week between Xi and Biden, I think, it surprised on the upside. It was more constructive than people were expecting. That was also true of the 4 or 5 phone calls they've had before. But it doesn't change the underlying fundamental problem between the US and China, which is that you can have more crises over Taiwan or anywhere else, and there are all sorts of reasons they disagree. So the fact that when Biden and Xi talk to one another, it lowers the temperature just a little bit, doesn't solve any of the underlying structural problems. And there's no sign that even these occasional conversations that they have make any progress in solving those structural problems. They simply cool things down for a little bit until the next blow up.
I was in Japan a couple weeks ago, and Nisid and our other colleagues met with various U.S. and Japanese officials, and it's very front of mind right now in Japan that, in their view, that it's not a question of if, but when, in terms of China invading Taiwan. Play with that idea for a minute. Do you think it's inevitable that China is going to try to absorb Taiwan militarily, directly, or through back channels? And if and when that happens, what do you think the consequences would be?
I genuinely don't think anybody knows. So we at the IISS have China analysts. They tend to be more sober than the American voices that you hear with a specific timetable of 2 years or 5 years. I would be surprised if such a timetable exists. I think President Xi is creating a military that is going to be capable of trying to do that in 5 to 10 years' time, but I don't think that any decision has been made, and I think China would prefer a situation in which there was a peaceful Hong Kong-style bringing together. I think the more likely scenario is that we are entering an era in which the crisis that we saw over the Pelosi visit, that kind of tension over Taiwan is just going to become more common. So between the third and what you might call the fourth Taiwan crisis, there was more than a decade. I don't think we're going to have to wait very long before we have another crisis over Taiwan. And that will be the challenge that Biden and Xi can talk to one another from time to time. But if we enter a period in which periods of crisis over Taiwan are more common, then the risk of escalation becomes much more real. And that, I think, is what worries people in Southeast Asia in particular. Not that Xi is going to decide to invade in a year's time, which he might do, but it's quite unlikely, but more that you stumble into a conflict through an accidental escalation of something that starts out quite small but gets bigger.
World War I.
Very similar. I mean, very similar. A lot of people have been reading the book about sleepwalking into World War I, and it has some analogies. So very different. This is a maritime region, not a land combat region. But if you look at the run at the 5 years before World War I, there were a series of crises. Not every single one of them, they were de-escalated, but they created tensions, and then eventually they created the context in which the road to war happened. So I think there are lessons to be learned from that period in history, yes.
You know, Nisid, in the context of random actors in all of this, we also have North Korea. And they've launched in recent weeks, I think, over 24 missiles, not far off the shores of Japan, also alarming the Japanese. Is China doing enough to rein in North Korea, or are they quite happy to have North Korea be a provocative actor in the region?
I think they're quite happy to have North Korea be a provocative actor up to a certain point, right? Something that destabilizes the U.S., distracts the U.S., is fine. It's the same reason, one of the reasons why China supports Pakistan so much, because it distracts India a bit, distracts them attention-wise, resources, and so on. But I don't think China wants to provoke a crisis on the Korean Peninsula. I think Biden made very clear in his meeting with Xi that the natural reaction of the U.S. and Japan and South Korea to these missile tests is going to be a much larger and stronger U.S. military presence in the region. That is the last thing China wants to see. So I think, Xi Jinping at this moment probably desires stability more than anything else. I think if he wants to show some goodwill, if he wants to build on this meeting that he had with Biden, both sides need to do things that start to build a little bit of trust between them. This is a relatively easy place where he could try and exert some influence. It's not to say that he has full control over what Kim Jong-un does and can tell him what to do. It's far from that at this point. He can express his displeasure. He can sort of make clear where he stands. Same thing with Putin as well. I think if this is a little more unlikely because the reasons China has supported Russia in this particular case are very long-term and broad and strategic and have to do with the fact that they both see the U.S. as an enemy. But she does not want to see Putin be outright defeated, cast out of power. And if this leads to a broader war, if it leads to a stronger NATO response, again, that's going to disrupt the global economy. It's going to threaten Putin's rule. China has an interest in trying to forestall that.
So does the Indo-Pacific region need its own version of NATO?
I don't think so. I don't think you would be able to get one, first of all. I don't think the countries in the region, that's what they're looking for. I think what you have right now, these sort of overlapping mini-lateral groupings, AUKUS with Australia, the UK, and the US. The Quad is not a military alliance, but has some coordination functions. And then the bilateral U.S. Alliances with Japan, South Korea, and so on. I think those are probably enough, with enough coordination, to bolster deterrence against China, and also able to keep everyone on side, right? I think what you don't want to do is start pushing countries to choose, are you going to join this organization, or are you going to keep trading with China, and so on. They don't want to do that. They never have, and there's no reason for them to start now.
Our time has already whipped by. I'm going to do a little rapid-fire round, and then we'll conclude. John, will Vladimir Putin use a nuke in Europe? Yes or no?
No. No, and I think there is one interesting point, which, on what Nisid was built, I think China has a strategic interest in standing by Russia. I'm not quite sure it has a strategic interest in standing by Vladimir Putin.
James, will President Xi continue down a path of closing China in and off from the rest of the world, or are some of the baby steps he took this week around opening both the economy up a little bit and opening the country itself up to more diplomatic channels continue?
The former, not the latter. I think China is moving on a path towards technological self-reliance, and that's in part because the Americans are forcing them to do that.
Nisid, do the midterm results in the U.S. give Biden a stronger hand to play around national security issues and foreign affairs?
A little bit. I wouldn't overestimate it, but it does. The opposite case, if there had been a red wave, would have weakened him dramatically, I think. So this is a bit better for him.
All right. Thank you guys for joining us at the last minute, and thank all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.